And welcome to our webinar. Welcome to Let's Talk About Applying Intersectionality in Public Health, Part 2. And this is brought to you by the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health. My name is Pema Mazumdar. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a knowledge translation specialist at the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health. The NCCDH is located in what is now known as Antigonish, Nova Scotia in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties do not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognize Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and establish the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. The NCCDH supports the public health community to address both structural and social determinants of health. And this is to bring about, at a societal level, improved population health and reduced inequities. And you can learn more about the NCCDH and about other NCCs. There are 6 of them, and each works across Canada in different theme areas at nccph.ca. It's important for me to say that while I'm speaking on behalf of a center located in Mi'kma'ki, what is now known as Nova Scotia, I am physically located in Tshakake, Montreal, on the unceded lands and territories of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabeg. I want to also acknowledge who has experienced racial and colonial violence here. And slavery was established in what is now known as Quebec, where I live, through a royal mandate by Louis XIV in 1689. In the years that followed, and when those treaties of peace and friendship were signed in Mi'kma'ki, Black people were either enslaved or fleeing from being enslaved in what we now know as Nova Scotia. And so what's more, slavery was only abolished by the British Empire, including what's now known as Canada, in 1834. And it's really important for me to say this and sort of sit with it and bring it to this space because we're gearing up for a conversation on applying intersectionality, which we discussed in the past webinar. I'm guessing that many of you joined us for that past webinar or have had the chance to listen to it before joining this one. And in the past webinar, we discussed how intersectionality has its roots in Black feminist resistance and requires an ongoing reflection and action on what it means to engage in anti-racist approaches, what it means to engage in decolonial approaches, what it means to dismantle multiple systems of oppression, and really believe that change for the better is possible and lean into trying to accomplish that. So all that being said, I'm really happy to be back with you for part 2 of this series. And once again, I'm co-hosting this webinar with my colleague, Bernice Yanfel. Hi, Bernice.
Hi, Pema. I'm happy to be joining you today. I'm from what is now known as Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples.
Great, thank you so much, Bernice. And Bernice is going to be moderating our panel very soon, and I'm just so looking forward to that. And I'll also be introducing our panelists soon. But before we get to that, I just want to give us a bit of an intro and recap to set us up for today. And so we'll just move along to our objectives here. Today, we hope that we'll help you to reflect on the tacit knowledge shared by our diverse speakers. And we hope that you'll consider opportunities to apply intersectionality in your practice. We hope that you'll lean into that opportunity to engage in dialogue with others about applying intersectionality in your own organizational context. And if there's other things that we achieve today, we're happy to hear them. These are our 3 sort of objectives for you today, and really our hopes about what we'll accomplish together. We wanted to check in today with a poll. We wanted to take the pulse of this virtual room. And our question for you is, how are you feeling? If you could pick 1 or 2 words to describe this, how you're feeling about applying intersectionality, what would they be? And we've set up a Slido for you to do this. The information about the Slido is either on this slide, you can scan the QR code, or you can look in the chat box and there'll be some information there. And we should start to see this populating. So how are you feeling about applying intersectionality? And I like to start with that feeling piece because, oh, that's the code. There you go. Hopeful, energized, because, I also say hold two feelings at once because it is entirely possible to hold both feelings of, I'm going to say, confusion or nervousness or inexperience with being excited and hopeful and curious. So we're seeing lots of people say that they're excited, they're hopeful, they're uncertain. Nice to see these words coming in. Frustrated with the lack of engagement on this topic. Feeling of don't want to make things worse. Critically conscious, excited, naive, positive. Okay, some good words in there. So great, thank you so much for letting me sort of check in with how we're feeling here in this collective virtual room. I personally am going to lean in to my curiosity and optimism for this topic and do a memory refresh or recap of sorts. I want to talk about what is intersectionality and where did it come from in a kind of lightning recap. When we last met in the first webinar, Bernice did a great job of walking us through the history and tracing the roots and evolution of intersectionality. We heard about how through the 1970s and 80s, Black, Latina, Indigenous, and Asian feminists, activists, and scholars contributed to the development of intersectionality as both an intellectual and political project, and how in 1977, a group of Black feminists, the Combahee River Collective, sorry, my tongue tripped me there, that they released a statement that described how multiple interwoven forms of oppression shaped daily experiences. We, of course, talked about Kimberly Crenshaw being credited for coining the term in 1989 and how it's been taken up in popular discourse and media ever since, and in some cases misunderstood, misapplied, and weaponized. We also talked about intersectionality as a concept, as a framework, an analytical strategy, and a movement for social justice. And we said that it considers ways that systems of oppression, like racism, classism, ableism, sexism, heteronormativity, are interwoven, and that it calls for actions on these interwoven systems. One of the things that seemed to really resonate for those on the line, because we heard about it in our evaluations, was to hear what intersectionality is not, that it's not a synonym for diversity. It's not about only identity. It's not competitive or hierarchical. It's not about one oppressive system taking priority over another. And another thing that seemed to really resonate, and you'll see the graphic come up here, was to think of intersectionality as a lens with which to understand and ultimately address that experience of structural inequality or structural inequity, as we say here in Canada. This graphic is from Scotland, so they use that word inequality a little differently. Finally, we talked about the importance of engaging in Finally, we started talking about this framework, the one that's on the screen here, I was skipping ahead, that we included in our Let's Talk Intersectionality. And that this really adapts work that's been done in 4 very well-known public health roles for improving health equity that are likely known to many of you. So that first role is to assess and report on health inequalities with an intersectionality approach. And this has to do with data, analysis, research, and more. The second role that you'll see here to the right of that 12 o'clock kind of mark on the circle is to modify and orient interventions with an intersectionality approach. And so this really gets at the everyday work within a public health unit or regional health authority. The third role is about, and I'm going to the left of that 12 o'clock mark now, is about engaging in intersectionality informed policy development. And the fourth role is about taking an intersectional approach to partnerships with those in other sectors and centering the voices of those who are most marginalized by multiple oppressive systems. So, and that fourth role, of course, plays into all of the other roles. The engaging with across sectors, partnering with other sectors, being with and in community. So finally, we talked about the importance of engaging in critical praxis. And this is a continuous process of learning, reflection, action. It means thinking about our own thinking and thinking about our theory on how social and health inequalities or inequities are produced, how are they maintained, and then intentionally linking this to the action or work to address those inequalities or inequities. One thing that we didn't get to in the last webinar, and I think is important to bring into the sort of virtual space here, is to think about intersectionality as a values-driven approach. I think that's useful because what I mean is that taking an intersectionality approach is one of the many ways that you or your organization can make values like health equity, social justice, compassion, humility. There's so many different values that support that health equity orientation that can make those values come to life. And so I just wanted to put that out there that we have talked about values before in our past documents, and my colleague Nandini is going to link to those in the chat box, and that we think of intersectionality as a values-driven approach. And so with any values-driven approach, it's not always easy because there are common value tensions to try and navigate. And one of those tensions is being ready for change, being ready to do things differently, like taking an intersectionality approach or an intersectional approach, ready to disrupt the status quo, and then having this be in stark contrast or tension with a desire that's present in society and present in all the organizations and systems within society to keep things exactly the way they are. And I've just enlarged, I don't know if you can read them, some of the examples that we discuss in that Let's Talk. And one of those is, for example, if you're talking about being in that role of engaging with community, that role area of partnering across sectors, if you keep things the way they are, you're more likely to engage in limited consultations without incorporating knowledge shared. And at the other end of that tension sort of spectrum would be viewing those who experience systemic disadvantage as active partners and decision makers. And so I just wanted to put that up there because you can really map on almost any challenge onto this value tension. And I think that this is one of the value tensions that comes up and is likely to come up when we talk about applying intersectionality in public health. We have a great group of panelists today who can perhaps help us to navigate some of these value tensions and tricky pieces a little bit more depth with more ability than me, really. They probably have some important insights on the opportunities to apply intersectionality within public health. And I've heard them all speak and read their work before. And so I know that they're just going to bring such great things to today's conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce them to you, and then I'm going to hand it over to Bernice, who's going to lead us in some roundtable conversation. So Samia Abdi is first up here on the screen, and she is the executive director of the Black Health Education Collaborative. She's a dynamic leader who supports public health to confront and address anti-Black racism and its intersecting systems of oppression, to use critical race theory as a foundational tool for systems change. And you've met Samia likely if you've been attending our webinars in the past, really anywhere from this year to the past 5+ years. You've likely met Samia before. So Samia, thank you for coming back and being with us today. Dr. Maya Josephson is an associate professor at Simon Fraser University. She's an eco-social health equity scholar who engages in community-based and intersectionality research with applications to ecosystem, human, and more than human health. And I'm really thrilled that you're able to be here today with us. Thank you, Maya. Ramona Chibegu is an assistant professor, Johnson Shoyoma Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Regina. Ramona is an informatics epidemiologist, currently researching how cultural humility, embodied privacy, and virtual reality simulation can improve nursing education on BIPOC, and that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color healthcare experiences. And she has a keen interest in using statistical modeling to apply critical race theory to qualitative health equity analysis. Thanks for being here with us, Ramona. I'm really looking forward to what you have to share. Sharmeen Faruqi is a policy analyst supporting the Health Inequalities Reporting Initiative at the Public Health Agency of Canada. The initiative, which is known as HIRI, aims to strengthen measurement, monitoring, reporting, and action on health inequalities in Canada through improved access to data and the development of resources to improve our knowledge of health inequalities. HIRI is committed to advancing the conversation on data equity practices and promising practices to integrate intersectionality theory in quantitative health equity analysis. Dr. Ashley Christofferson, postdoctoral fellow, Simon Fraser University, honorary fellow, University of Edinburgh, is a researcher, former equalities practitioner, and consultant who sought to apply intersectionality in community development and research and studied its application by practitioners and policymakers in the United Kingdom. I'm just going to give a little plug here. We've recently added some of her work to our resource library on the NCCDH. So if you've seen intersectionality in practice come across your screen lately in our newsletter, that's Dr. Ashley Christofferson's work. Christian de Bood, Health Equity Manager for Middlesex London Health Unit, is a health equity leader. He supports staff at all levels to understand and apply the Ontario Public Health Standard of Health Equity. This requires an understanding and the understanding and application of intersectionality in their everyday work. So thank you so much, Christian. Thank you so much, Ashley, Sharmeen, Ramona, Maya, and Samia for being here with us today. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Bernice, who's going to ask you some really good questions, we hope.
Great. Thank you so much, Pema. We're so excited to have such great panelists today who bring a wealth of expertise and experience in applying and supporting the application of intersectionality. I now have the great pleasure of asking our panelists a couple of questions before we move into our breakout rooms. So in our previous session, one of the things we talked about that Pema recapped today is understanding what intersectionality is and what intersectionality is not, and having that clear understanding is important to how we apply it. So how do we build that understanding? So beyond sessions like these, doing our own learning around intersectionality is critical. So my first question for our panelists is, how did you first learn about intersectionality and how do you maintain and grow that knowledge? So Samia, can you get us started?
Sure, happy to do that. Hi, everyone. So being a Black person, being a visibly Muslim person, and being a woman, I've always lived an intersectional life. And sometimes it's, you have these experiences of being othered in different spaces based on what hijab, what hat you wear. So sometimes you cannot show up. If there's a feminist discussion, then you have to park your Blackness at the door. If there's a race discussion, you might have to park your Islam at the door. So things like that, and understanding there has been always a challenge to show up as myself as a full human with all of these things, and also understanding that intersectionality is not about identity, but it's about power and disempowerment. So knowing that when we're talking about intersectionality, we're talking about systems of disempowerment and how these things, as Pema and Bernice had talked about in the previous sessions, that these things are not additive, but they are synergetic, and then they add on, like it's amplified. These different oppressions are amplifiable. So the term itself, I came across about 10 years ago doing work and having conversations in public health and understanding where equity comes in. And when we're addressing issues of equity, sometimes we tend to only address poverty or class or race or disability, and not understanding that there are people who are Black, who are disabled, who also live in poverty, who also need food security and all of those things. And these folks have unique experiences. So besides my own life, and it's always enlightening and exciting when you find a language that describes your own experiences, and you're like, oh, there's a term for it, and there's a theory behind it, and it's not all in my head. So I was really delighted to learn about the work, even though this work has existed 30 years ago, but I only came across it maybe 8 to 10 years ago.
Thank you so much, Samia. There's so much richness there. How about for you, Maya? How did you first encounter this notion of intersectionality, and how do you work to maintain and grow that knowledge?
Yeah, thanks so much, Bernice, and Samya. Thank you for your answer, which I resonate with a lot. I think you know, I'm a white person in a white supremacist society, so um, I grew up with that privilege, but also with a lot of challenges in my own life. And so as a child, and then moving into my adult world, I was looking for a way to have a language around the kinds of issues that I was living through. And so I took degrees in women's studies and sociology. So I was learning about a lot of the theories around intersectionality, and was really aware, being a student in those spaces, about the problematics, but also the possibilities and potentials, and just the ways in which words, at least for me, I was experiencing words giving voice to experiences I was having that were invisibilized, that were explained away or pathologized and so on. So intersectionality was a very exciting encounter to have, because as Samia said, it brings things together in a way that is very useful, both in terms of our identities, but also in terms of our relationship to institutions and structures. It wasn't until I had come back to Canada from being in the UK for about 10 years that I really came into a space where intersectionality had traction, where it was being used in quite dynamic ways, particularly at Simon Fraser University, where it's quite an alive concept. So I use this term a lot now. I wanted to just speak to a couple of ways in which my thinking about intersectionality is growing. One is my encounter with the idea of red intersectionality, and the work coming from Natalie Clark and others who are talking about from an Indigenous feminist and Indigenous feminist as healer type of approach, where they are talking about Indigenous identities are very much more complex than the colonized notion of identity. So it's this intersectionality is part of Indigenous culture as well, and that Indigenous women have been dealing with intersectional challenges since times of colonial encounter. And so that was really helped me start to decolonize my thinking around intersectionality. And the other thing that I found really exciting was encountering the Métis Women of Canada's work around intersectionality, where they take the intersectionality flower, or the image that we have of the identities that we usually foreground, those related to structural and social determinants of health, and add to it another set of values and key aspects of our identity that are informed by being Métis, our connection to land, culture, one another, community, spirit, and so on. And so I realize now that there's many, many dimensions to an intersectionality flower, in a sense, that need to come to life if we're really going to talk about intersectionality in a way relevant to a broad range of people. So thanks.
Thank you, Maya. That's great. And you mentioned a lot of important resources there. So it'd be great if we can link to those in the chat. We'll make sure that we get those. You mentioned in particular red intersectionality. So we'll definitely make sure we link to that. And I loved what you said about problematics, but also possibilities. I think that's so key and so important to keep in mind. How about for you, Ramona?
Thank you, Bernice. as an epidemiologist, I could certainly talk about my lived experience. I wanted to start as an epidemiologist in the way that I was trained. I was certainly aware of the various intersections and the ways in which we can, parse data in order to make comparisons. So I think my initial understanding of intersectionality was rather reductionist in terms of the way that I was trained. It was really about comparing things, averaging things, looking for differences in main effects and not really exploring those interactions or exploring, the multi-level factors that could impact on, individual experiences as it relates to someone's identity or social position. So I would say that where my understanding of intersectionality became much more complex and more aligned with sort of the feminist theory was when I went on to do my PhD. And I was taught under Robert Babb, who is really the leading thinker of critical media studies. And, in learning from him, I learned a lot about different hidden structures within our society and the ways in which we can sort of look at systems of oppression and how they impact different groups differently. And I think that really sort of gave me a more nuanced understanding of intersectionality that existed beyond my own lived experience, which of course I have lots of lived experience as a Black female of Caribbean and African heritage. But in terms of as an epidemiologist, it sort of allowed me to think about I think what the NCCIH talks about a lot, the causes of causes, the outcomes of outcomes, and really looking at taking a longitudinal view, I think, of intersectionality when I'm analyzing data. So currently, as far as how I've changed or grown, I've sort of mentioned PhD studies in media studies and sort of drawing on some of the great philosophical thinkers to really reshape my thinking and to be more reflexive about how I ask questions and to be less reductionist. So some unlearning had to happen. But my current research right now, apart from what you've mentioned, really focuses on bringing theory to practice. I used to be a knowledge broker at the NCCMT, so theory, methods, and tools was really important to me, and I wanted to bring that to my work. And one thing that I've been doing is I've been working with structural equation modeling and more novel approaches to be able to analyze different questions, to look at problems from a multi-level perspective, to look at groups and to look at, different policy contexts and how that might interact with an individual or different aspects of an individual, and to avoid that reductionist approach, to sort of consider individuals in their whole and their experiences, and to use my quantitative approaches as a starting point to ask more questions and to use other approaches to sort of support that. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating to hear about your journey and how it's evolved over time and how you're currently integrating that into your thinking and your work. That's great. And Sharmeen, I'll come to you now. Are there any thoughts you would like to share in terms of how you gain that knowledge and how you maintain it?
Thanks, Bernice. So I first learned about the word intersectionality when I was conducting an undergraduate thesis at McMaster University in 2012. And it was a qualitative study that was evaluating a supportive housing program for people who were living with mental illness, but also in conflict with the criminal justice system and experiencing precarious housing. So it was a very vulnerable group of people. And we were trying to identify what works and what could be improved within the supportive housing program. And when drafting my thesis, I needed a word to describe the intersecting identities of the participants. And I came across the term intersectionality. But in the end, and on the advice of my very thoughtful supervisor at the time, we agreed to not use the word intersectionality in my thesis, given that race and racialization wasn't a specific area of exploration within the thesis itself. And so I wanted to share this example because it aligns with a theme that was discussed in the last NCCDH webinar on intersectionality about misuse and the importance of understanding the intent, definitions, operationalization, and constructs and terms that we're using in public health to avoid misuse. And since that experience in my undergraduate degree, my understanding of the term intersectionality has grown, though I'm by no means an expert. And it has primarily grown through my work at the Public Health Agency of Canada, which is continuously informed by the Government of Canada's Sex and Gender-Based Analysis Plus. So SGBA Plus is recognized by the federal government as a key competency in supporting the development of effective programs and policies for Canadians. It's an analytical process that's used within the health portfolio, and it incorporates intersectionality theory. And intersectionality theory sort of underpins SGBA plus analysis by assessing how factors such as sex, gender, age, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, disability, cultural, racial background, etc., interact and intersect with one another and other broader systems of power to shape one's experience of the world and of public policies in particular. So the aim of SGBA Plus is to analyze our policies, our programs, and our services and their effects within the context of these intersections, and then to draw on such analyses and devising strategies to prevent further perpetuation of harm, of inequities, of systemic oppression, but also build towards the elimination of such structural issues. And so as part of our responsibilities within the health portfolio, it's our role to continuously build our knowledge of intersectionality theory and SGBA Plus through training and capacity building. We have a network where SGBA Plus network, where intersectionality theory in particular and its application is a constant topic of discussion. And so much of my learning on intersectionality theory at this time and its application to public health comes through SGBA Plus learning activities within the health portfolio.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharmeen. It's great to hear how you've gone within your earlier studies of not using the word intersectionality to now it being a part of your regular practice. So it was great to hear your journey as well. Great. Now, why don't we go to Ashley if you have some thoughts you would like to share on this?
Hi, everyone. It's a real privilege to be here with such an amazing panel. Yeah, so for myself, I first heard the term intersectionality sort of at the same time as an activist and a student in women's studies, so similarly to Maya as well, at Simon Fraser University here in Vancouver, where I'm speaking to you from on unceded Coast Salish territories, and this was back in the early 2000s. And so, yeah, as a white settler, intersectionality largely enables me to see the privileges that I have, which really, at the time I heard the term, kind of ran counter to what I was learning in a lot of my women's studies courses, which was really that all women are oppressed in the same or similar ways. And I think things have moved on now, certainly at SFU, so they're not teaching that anymore, although it continues to be taught in the UK and particularly in wider Europe. So, but intersectionality also kind of helped me to make sense of how these privileges kind of simultaneously interact with other aspects of my identity, as for example, queer and the first in my family to attend university. So coming from a very different place to many of the other students on my courses. In terms of how I maintain and grow this knowledge, I'll speak more about this as we move through the webinar, but largely through research and lots of reading about intersectionality, which I'm privileged to do as part of my current job roles. As everyone here will know, it's a hugely dynamic and growing area across all the fields of kind of academic research, policymaking, and practice. And when I talk about practice, I'm mainly talking about the work of non-governmental organizations, but it also, of course, includes public health practitioners. I also maintain and grow this through consultancy around intersectionality and ongoing connection to activism and non-governmental organizations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ashley. We're looking forward to learning more about how you apply intersectionality in your work. Thank you so much. Great. So We're going to move to our second question. And Christian, I didn't forget about you. Don't worry. We're going to move into our second question. And if you can also speak to how you maintain and grow that knowledge as part of your response, Christian, that'd be great. So one of the great things about our panel is that we have people who represent such a huge diversity of roles related to public health, which I imagine is similar to the diversity of roles among our attendees today. And that means what intersectionality looks like when applied will also differ. So I'm curious to hear from our panelists how they apply or support the application of intersectionality in their work. So brief responses are great here. A number of you have already touched on it, but for those who haven't, we would love to hear just a taste of how you're applying it, and we'll have a chance to get into it more deeply later on in the session. So Christian, if you can please start us off, and we'll also like to hear a little bit about how you first encountered intersectionality and how you grow that knowledge.
Thank you, Bernice. I'll try to wrap all three of the questions into my response. So I came upon the term a few years back when I was doing my master's in counseling psychology, and what was interesting, it was an important concept within the feminist psychotherapy program that I was in. Certainly underpin feminist psychotherapy, and it was very important to the idea of person-centered care. And that's the way that I came about the work. So it was about understanding the client in a holistic way. And I found what Ramona said really interesting, because I did sort of use other theories in psychology around like Gestalt. So I came about it in a way how the sum of its parts are greater than if you cannot reduce people to different parts. And so when you put several things together, you get something completely new. It's not just a collection of things, but something completely different. And because people are made up of lots of different kinds of things, you can never know what the final product is until you engage with them and you understand through their own eyes what it is to be that person. And that you can apply to groups as well, even in our own in Middlesex London, that the way that we think about a prior population has to be informed by the way that they understand their context, they understand their history, they understand all the variables that are acting upon them. This is both positive strength-based and those things that might be challenging them. So that's the way, and the way that I've grown that is through practice. So I'll use the example of how we help, how we apply that in a way, because application is the way that I grow my understanding of the concept. As an example, currently we're working with Indigenous partners around the collection and sharing of data, indigeneity, race. But it's come from conversations where they provide us information about particularly gaps that we had in the way that as a public health unit we were interacting with them. And as we're building things together, like policies, procedures, et cetera, we're preparing to pilot the collection of information. One of the things that I find interesting, that I find using the word "and" as a way of reminding people of the complexity of things. So some of it is about kind of reflective practice in action as you interact with your colleagues, with your partners, and even just doing that before you engage, a partner reminds you that, what am I missing? And some of it is about asking those questions. So this is, we believe this is a truth, and what else can you tell me about this? And that, sort of allows the people that you're working with to add those other components that we may not be thinking about, that then transforms your work in a different direction, makes it something new. And I think that covers my all the questions in a way.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christian. And what's really resonating with me as people are speaking is that we've all had different starting places when it comes to learning about intersectionality, but there's so much like richness in those different starting places. And it's interesting to hear how people are now like learning, growing that knowledge, maintaining it, and applying it in their daily work. So thank you so much. I wonder for you, Maya, if you wanted to touch on a little bit about how you apply or support the application of intersectionality.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Health Science, working a lot on public health. So I have a job to both conduct research, but also to educate students, MPH students. And then I'm also a community engaged researcher, and I do policy. So I have this kind of broad space that I move through. And what I've realized is I just carry intersectionality with me. So I am a values-based, theory-driven researcher. And so what that helps me do is to make sure that we take the central wheel of intersectionality, and then to ask, whose lives and whose realities are really important here. And I work a lot on the impacts of intensive resource extraction on rural, remote, northern and indigenous communities. I work a lot on climate change and youth and mental health. And so and I work a lot on interspecies justice and intergenerational justice. So issues where I'm trying to link things. And so I have this image in my mind of intersectionality as the classic wheel that we use. And then I am also really keen to think about what is the identity wheel and the kind of agency and oppression wheel that other people need, for example, children. So what is a intersectional wheel for children? What it would be an intersectional wheel for more than human species, for animals and microbiota and so on. So that's something that I'm constantly thinking about, is how do we extend our understanding of who matters and how they matter, and how do they fit into the social justice frame that I think intersectionality tries to bring us into, and really animate solutions that foreground the needs of equity seeking and sovereignty seeking populations. So I can give more examples later, but that's kind of the framework I use, and how I bring the idea to my students as well. So to think about identity, social structure, but also to be planetary beings living in sustainability on this earth.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Maya. And how about for you, Samia? Did you want to talk a little bit about the applications that you engage in within your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So the majority of my work, or the lens that I work from, is an anti-oppression, anti-racism one, and particularly focusing on anti-Black racism, which is important to note that it's a term coined by Dr. Afua Benjamin. So thinking about anti-Black racism, and in my current role and previously within public health, this idea of capacity building, education, creating trainings that is centered around a foundational concept around critical race theory, and that we cannot also speak about intersectionality without really talking about critical race theory, as intersectionality is a tenet of critical race theory. So thinking about when we are, creating curriculum, whether it's for public health practitioners or students, or people who are in mid-career, or policymakers and healthcare practitioners in general, including clinicians, thinking about understanding things that colorblindness does not exist, that we cannot think about people as Christian and others were talking about as just one part of who they are. So particularly doing the work that I do around with Black communities across the country, understanding also the heterogeneity of Black communities, that when we're talking about the Black experience within the healthcare system, we're talking about the Black queer experience, the Black Muslim experience, the Black person with disability, the Black person who's a new immigrant, the Black person who is an African Nova Scotian or an African Canadian who have multi-generational history of enslavement, and how these traumas are show up in different ways to impact our health and well-being as a collective. And then the final thing that I wanted to mention is this idea of, as a public health practitioner and as an educator and a researcher, thinking about when we're thinking about topics such as diabetes, organ donations, or even climate change, having an opportunity to dig down on who is experiencing having different differential experiences and differential outcome because of their gender, race, income. And then the last quick example that I want to give is that I was thinking about the climate change movement and the people who are active in the climate change movement and whose voices are often heard, because also voice and validated experience is part of the critical race theory. It's part of intersectionality. So thinking about heat waves and experiences of heat during the summer months, which are approaching us, and how people, even in our own cities in this country, experience heat differently based on where they're located, based on how much shade is provided in these locations. And then if we can easily assume that it's just a matter of geography. But often when we do that deeper look and see who are the folks in these communities that are experiencing heat that is up to 5 to 10 degrees higher than certain other neighborhoods, we often find these are racialized communities, often Black communities, often communities who have lower income and lower resources provided to them. So intersectionality can be applied not only in policy making, but also understanding and analyzing the way we're producing knowledge and creating training and capacity building.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sammy. And I loved how you connected that to very concrete examples about the communities that are most affected by some of these issues. Thank you so much. Great. So why don't we move into our breakout rooms now, and we'll be rejoining with the panel a little bit later on. So I'll pass it back to Pema, who will lead us into the breakout room.
So hello, everybody. So I just was in a breakout room having a really nice conversation with a few others. And a lot of what was being said resonated with some of what we're seeing up here on the screen. So I'm just going to ask Rebecca, who's doing a great job of controlling our slides, to scroll down a little bit so we can see, and maybe just scroll down slowly so we can have a little read. So I heard about challenging political contexts. I'm reading here that we heard in the workplace that, oh, sorry, Rebecca, can you just go back up? Thanks. The programs need to target real or normal francophones, push back against numerous programs that support BIPOC folks. I'm not sure what that means, but I'd be interested to know if somebody wants to add a little bit of a note there. I'm reading that in the context for intersectionality right now is a little bit lip service. Not too many people know what it is and how to apply it. That resonates with what I've heard. It's challenging with all the red tape. The issues need to be handled one at a time rather than looking at a whole of system and taking a whole of systems approach to addressing multiple oppressive systems. Thanks, Rebecca. If you can just scroll down now. That's the challenging political context piece that I had heard about in my breakout group. I'm reading here: planning, equity, determinants of health data, nuance, local, strengths-based. Okay. I see that those are keywords. I'm going to try not to make a sentence of it. So it says, we know that we are addressing issues one at a time for single equity dimensions, and that we'll try and advocate for change. So I think that is fairly typical, that when we tend to engage in equity work, that the sort of, if we were thinking about that value tension piece, that the stay where readiness to change versus staying where things are at would be, if you're addressing equity, it being done in a fairly one-dimensional way without necessarily that larger context of what is the whole system? What is the context that makes that data come alive, and that can inform our actions in a much more in a way that is much more aligned with taking an intersectionality approach. So thank you for engaging in those breakout groups. I know that we're scratching the surface, and we may well have more discussion that the NCCDH convenes on this topic. We're certainly not closing the book on this topic anytime soon. So this is just one opportunity to engage with each other. We hope that you had the chance to meet some interesting people, hear about different organizational contexts. So thank you for engaging. I'm going to turn it back over to Bernice just to make sure that we get to some of the other good questions that we had planned for the panel. And then we will give you a chance to ask some questions. We've already had about 3, and so we'll pick some of our top questions and ask them at the end of our session. Go for it, Bernice.
Great. Thank you so much, Pema. And so now we really want to get into some of the concrete pieces in terms of, so then what? What does intersectionality look like when it's applied in different areas? So as we mentioned, our panelists occupy a wide breadth of different roles. And now I would like to dive into more about what it means to apply intersectionality if applied faithfully. And by a faithful application of intersectionality, we mean an intersectionality that is not diluted and aligns with its original intentions, and is oriented towards tackling intersected systems of oppression and advancing health equity. So we'd really like to hear from our panelists about, ideally, what would intersectionality look like applied to these different areas? So for you, Maya, can you get us started? We would look to you to speak to applying intersectionality in the areas of teaching and learning. So you're a professor at Simon Fraser University, and you also have a lot of experience supporting gender-based analysis plus approaches. So what are your thoughts about a faithful application of intersectionality in the areas of teaching and learning?
Yeah, thanks, Bernice. I wanted to speak to Kate, your question about examples of culture change in an organization briefly. I think that we're talking about changing culture, and so one of the things that has happened at SFU is that we have this commitment to EDI. We have a president who has created an EDI council or advisory council made up of many voices that are very challenging to her and to the institution. And now we have a VP People, Equity, and Inclusion. So that's just one example of the way things are changing. One of the things that I do with my students is very much to get them to think deeply about these kinds of ideas and to take case studies from the real world so that they can think about it. And to think a lot about the development of policy. So for example, we have done research with the Climate Action Secretariat in BC, trying to understand what are, through an intersectional lens, what are the impacts of climate events like floods on communities. And so we encourage our students to think through that, and we give them pieces of our research, for example, research we've done, really understanding, focusing on what's happening to equity-seeking and sovereignty-seeking populations. We find, and when we start to ask the questions about what is happening, for example, to Indigenous folks, to women and children and so on, we begin to understand that there's a lot of data silences. And so we go and we actually challenge mixed methods. We use mixed methods, challenging very quantitative orientation so that we can start to use narratives and experience of these folks. And our policy recommendations are novel. For example, we found that during an acute climate event, domestic violence rates increase, and there's a huge surge in women and children seeking safe housing, and that these safe housing are also not climate resilient and so on. So we get our students to think about those kinds of complexities. How do we bring in the voices of people who are not typically engaged with? And the other thing that we do is very much ask them to think about co-benefits work. So we know with intersectionality that we, as Audre Lorde says, we don't live these single issue lives, and our lives are shaped by our social identities, by our environments. We know, for example, that environmental racism is alive and well. So that's a place where ecological desecration and social injustices intersect. So we get our students to think a lot about, how do we solve issues from a co-benefits perspective? How could we deal with an environmental racism kind of situation, so that we can both deal with social discrimination, but also the impact to the environment? And so it's really good for them to think across sectors, to think intersectionality, to think across scales, and those things. And the last thing I'll say is that we also bring this lens, for example, into trying to build climate resilience plans in small communities, local, rural, remote communities. And there we really ask our students to apply our strength and asset-based approach as well. So they'll work with community to figure out not only what's wrong, but also how can we creatively multi-solve our issues, and what is the knowledge that people already have in communities, what are their strengths and their resources, and how can we bring that into the knowledge that we're gathering to develop these plans. So those would be a few examples of ways in which we use intersectionality to try and change evidence, change how we gather data, but also change how we work with community.
Thank you so much. I think there's so many key things that you're doing there, Maya. Thank you for sharing those examples. Great. So now why don't we move into talking about how we apply intersectionality with respect to program planning and implementation. So Christian, as someone who occupies a leadership role with the Middlesex London Health Unit, I'm hoping you can provide us with some insights about applying intersectionality in a faithful way, aligning with its social justice aims within that context.
Yeah, thank you, Bernice. I was reflecting that I think a key sort of approach to using the concept is to really, as I was saying before, to think of the people that we are working in collaboration with holistically, and that we're in relationship. And I think that's a crucial thing, that we're coming into contact. Sometimes like a person like myself, I have my own history of coming to this country as a refugee, of experiencing different privileges and disadvantages. And so I think what we try to do currently in the health equity team and reconciliation team is to support the collection of data that brings into focus all those different parts of the people that we're working with. We're currently in piloting the collection of SDOH data, of social determinant of health data. And we're starting off with indigeneity and race as being crucial, starting points, because they're based on the feedback of that we've had through interaction with Indigenous partners and members of the Black, Caribbean, and African community of London. And there's diversity within those groups. And so having that, the ongoing conversation is how we allow ourselves to be led by the interactions, by the knowledge that's created together that tells us, what things are important, what things are not important. And I think that, the idea that, we're also, again, we're trying to think holistically about the things that we want to work together, so that it's very much about a future orientation. Yes, there's deficits. Yes, there are strengths, but it's more about, how do we get to the future and how we navigate all those intersections, right? The fact that we have racism, that we have issues around, socioeconomic status. All those things are being talked about as we talk about something very concrete, like how will we begin to collect a piece of data, and the piece of data is not as important as how we come together and we learn about one another. Like that moment when a clinician might actually interact with a client, with our case, as we would call it in public health, or a person, and that we come prepared to think of them holistically, to think ourselves in a holistic way, that we're also not, that it may not just be, you're not just a nurse, but you're a nurse within context with your own intersectional contexts and identities. Preparing for those interactions is what is far more important, I think. The application of that in relationship, in collaboration is where we're focusing on. And I think that's resonating with both our staff and the people that we're working with. Because then I think we're demystifying some of the sort of the theory behind some of the concepts that we very much lean on to think about the work, but we have to make them real when it comes to like, how are we going to interact with one another doing a real interaction. So that's, I think, that the way that we continue to talk about these issues, and we raise them temporarily, but then we quickly try to move away so that we demystify the concept and we get to down, like, what does it mean for me as a person?
I think demystifying concepts can be so important. Related to that, I know at the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health, we talk a lot about helping public health practitioners see health equity as everyone's responsibility and everyone's daily work, right? And one of our attendees actually asked a great question. She asked, how can we as public health practitioners ensure that this is required for everyone who works in public health? So how can we ensure that everyone in public health is required to take an intersectionality lens in mind when doing their work? And it's not just falling on the people who occupy, social determinants of health specific roles. Can you comment on that, Christian?
Yeah, it's a big question. And it's something that I've been dealing with, not just in health equity, but, as I had leadership roles in healthcare in the past, and the issue of how do you incorporate those theoretical concepts or ways of working into day-to-day practice. It's been a problem that I've been trying to solve for a long time. And I think it is crucial that it has to be integrated into all the operational bits that create an organization. So things like policy and procedure need to be, you need to embed the language or the ideas, not necessarily the language at times, because like I was saying, sometimes you need to demystify, so you need to make it concrete. Like, how would intersectionality play out in the policy around SDOH data collection, for example? You don't need to have the name there, but it needs to play out in policy and procedure, in the training that you do, so that people are supported in understanding the complexity of the people they serve there, in the way that you are modifying and orienting your programs, right? It's, all those bits have to be incorporate leadership, your leadership approach in the way that you're making decisions with people. So one of the things that I feel very excited about the Middlesex London Health Unit is that those concepts I can see them living in some actionable way, an operational way at pretty much every part, whether it's in our hiring procedures to the way our CEO and medical officer or health are talking about things. And so fortunately, because I'm in the Public Health Foundations division, and the team oversees, works within that space, we're able to influence and have those conversations across the organization, including things like budgetary decisions. So making anti-Black racism a lens that we use for making budgetary decisions is a discussion that I had with our CEO recently, for example. So it is about spreading those ideas throughout, and then it eventually becomes part of the cadence of the actions that we use on a day-to-day basis. And a frontline staff that might be hired into the organization may actually not even understand how the concept of intersectionality is impacting them. But when the organization as a whole is moving in that way, they will simply begin to behave in this way. So I think it's maybe sometimes not necessary for people to know that the concept that, well, as long as you've created an organization that is behaving in ways that are consistent with it.
Yeah, I think that's huge. In your example of integrating a consideration of anti-Black racism in budgetary decisions, I think that's such a
Sorry, I was just going to add one little bit. Sorry for that. I think the way that we're combating racism, ageism, etc., all those systems of oppression, the same way. It has to be systemic. It's a systemic problem. So if you don't take a systemic approach, you're not going to have a significant. You do need to people, internalize racism because it's everywhere. They've been raised into it. So that's what I mean about staff. We need to raise them into a space that now it's, think concepts like intersectionality and social justice become part of the system that you're working in, and you will be influenced and moved in that direction, with awareness or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Christian. And now I'm going to come to Ashley. So Ashley, you've studied the application of intersectionality in policy and practice. For you in these areas, what does an application of intersectionality look like that is really attuned with social justice aims and that has the potential of advancing health equity?
Great question. Thank you, Bernice. So yeah, I'm just going to give a tiny bit of background to the research, just kind of put this into some context. So for about 6 years, I was working as a community development practitioner in London in a Black-led LGBTQ organization, an organization that really kind of sought to apply intersectionality, although we didn't always use that term. And in that role, around the time period that it was, I observed a lot of people who worked in equalities kind of struggling with how to apply intersectionality in the context of a very compartmentalized kind of equality sector. So that led me to undertake kind of in-depth research in 3 cities in the UK from about 2016 to 2019. So I'll share some links in the chat as well. So I will talk about an example from my research which relates to policy development and partnership. So I would say at the outset that I think this is always kind of an ongoing process. So I don't think anyone necessarily would be claiming in this space to be doing intersectionality right all of the time. So it's not to say that we can't critique this example. But this example does contrast to other examples, which nevertheless people thought of as being intersectional. So one of the kind of main things I found was that intersectionality is really applied in lots of different ways, and some of them are kind of more productive than others. So in one city in the UK, the local government and the health authority sought to develop a health equality strategy. And they engaged the city's network of equalities and human rights organizations really early on to kind of co-develop the strategy. And this network is comprised of racial justice, disability rights, LGBTQI rights, migrants' rights, feminist organizations, and kind of intersectional combinations of those. And this network really conceived of applying intersectionality as doing 2 things. So firstly, addressing broad issues which affect many differently marginalized groups. So for example, mental health and hate crime were 2 issues that the network worked on. And secondly, within work on these kind of broader issues, centering the needs, perspectives, and interests of specific groups marginalized by intersecting structures of inequality. So in these kind of sessions that the network held to co-develop this health equality strategy, they specifically sought to include intersectional organizations. So for example, Black women's organizations in addition to kind of single issue ones such as LGBT organizations. So another of my findings is that intersectional organizations are really the kind of experts in how to apply intersectionality. They're doing it all of the time. And yeah, there's more I could say about this. I think one of the key takeaways from this example is that in order to enable the participation of these groups, the local government and health authority via the network offered remuneration, so payment, to these groups and other things to be able to facilitate their participation in developing the quality strategy. But yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
That's great. Thank you, Ashley. And I read the report you produced around that, and it was so fascinating and so much richness in terms of the examples you provided and different approaches to applying intersectionality. So if we haven't already linked to it, we will make sure that we do that in the chat. Thank you so much. Great. So Sharmeen, I'm going to come to you now. And you are with the Public Health Agency of Canada that has produced a report on integrating intersectionality theory in quantitative health equity analysis. Can you speak to us about the report? How does it support a rigorous application of intersectionality?
Thanks so much, Bernie. So just to provide some context, I work for a team called the Equity Analysis and Policy Research Team within FACT's Strategic Policy Branch. And our team leads the Pan-Canadian Health Inequalities Reporting Initiative, HERI. And the goal of our initiative is to strengthen public health capacity to monitor and report on health inequalities in Canada with the goal of informing policy and reducing health inequalities. So in our first phase, we wanted to answer the question, what is the scope of health inequalities in Canada? And we launched a health inequalities data tool in 2017, as well as an accompanying narrative report that described the deepest inequalities observed in our analysis. And our health inequalities data tool was just recently updated in 2022 with some new indicators, new stratifiers, and updated results. And it's a publicly available tool, and I encourage everyone on the line to check it out because it could be used as part of an intersectionality theory-informed analysis because it contains over 160 indicators of health outcomes, daily living conditions, and structural determinants of health that can not only be disaggregated by sex, but also by other social stratifiers such as age, sexual orientation, Indigenous identity, cultural racial background, immigrant status, etc. Now, Bernice, as you mentioned, we are moving into a new phase of analysis within HERI to build on this work to answer more complex questions like what are the drivers of inequalities, what are the most effective interventions at reducing inequities, and how can we conduct research and analysis on populations in a culturally responsive way. And as we're entering this new phase of reporting, many of our partners have asked us and encouraged us to look towards ways to integrate intersectionality theory in our work. And so our team was interested in examining how to apply intersectionality theory in quantitative analysis of health inequalities. And so that's the report that you mentioned we released in 2022. And that report is called How to Integrate Intersectionality Theory and Quantitative Health Equity Analysis. It's a rapid review and checklist of promising practices. And this report is intended for a technical audience of public health professionals and health system actors with biostatistics and epidemiology training. And within the report, we do recognize the long history of Black feminist theorizing and scholarship that intersectionality theory emerges from. And within the report, we define intersectionality as an analytical framework and research paradigm that seeks to understand the ways in which interlocking systems of power construct and are enabled by intersecting social locations, such as race, gender, class, and so forth, through processes of privilege and oppression. So just to tell you a bit about the report, I think that the link is in the chat box if anyone would like to check it out. But basically, we wanted to look at and we wanted to identify promising practices to operationalize intersectionality theory into practice in every stage of health inequality analysis. So from early conception of the study all the way to data interpretation. And we conducted a rapid review. You can see the inclusion criteria for the studies that we included in the report itself. And basically, within the report, we use an analytical framework called the Intersectionality-Based Policy Analysis Framework, developed by Hank Viksky and colleagues in 2014. And in this framework, there are 8 different guiding principles that are proposed for intersectionality-based policy analysis. And these include social justice, equity, intersecting categories, multi-level analysis. So that refers to considering multi-level determinants of health, power, reflexivity, time and space, and diverse knowledges. And so we assess the extent to which and how the studies integrated these 8 guiding principles of intersectionality-based policy analysis in every section of the article. So the rationale, the analytic design, and interpretation section. And from there, we deduced promising practices that could be applied to future quantitative health equity analysis. So in total, we examined 34 studies and we identified 36 promising practices that we summarized in a checklist. And you can also find that checklist online. It's called Strengthening the Integration of Intersectionality Theory in Health Inequality Analysis. And I'll just give some brief examples of some of the promising practices that are included within this checklist. So as I mentioned, we divide the checklist into different sections, different sort of stages of the research process. So for the background and rationale, one promising practice would be to provide a well-referenced definition of intersectionality theory in the research work. And another promising practice would be to integrate and summarize evidence developed through research that involve populations that are affected by the inequalities and forms of knowledge that have been underrepresented in public health practice. So for the objectives, one promising practice would be to engage with the populations who are affected by the inequalities when establishing the scope of the research question or research objectives. For measures, one promising practice as an example would be to describe the assumptions about the broader social phenomena that the measures are capturing. So for instance, for race ethnicity, what are you assuming is being captured and why? Is our goal to capture or try to measure systemic racism or discrimination? These assumptions should be made clear in the methodology. Another promising practice might be using measures that are hypothetically modifiable or amenable to policy intervention. For the findings section, a promising practice would be to refer to intersectionality theory when interpreting the mechanisms that can explain the results. And finally, for the implications section, a promising practice would be to describe the implications of the study for public health practice and policy and systems change. And it's important to avoid sort of superficial applications of intersectionality theory, which can be appropriative if they neglect to acknowledge how transformative social change is required to address the intersecting systems of oppression that shape social and health inequities. And a final promising practice for that section might be including reflexivity about the power that was invested in and reproduced by the methods used. So there were 36 promising practices in total that are in the checklist, and we invite you to explore them all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharmeen. We've linked to the report in the chat. So to learn more about those promising practices, please check that out. Thank you so much. Ramona, I'm going to come to you now. I would love to hear your thoughts as a researcher and someone who has a keen interest in applying critical race theory in their work. What a faithful application of intersectionality looks like for you. And in addition to that, we had a question in the chat about how you have combined your interest in epidemiology and intersectionality throughout your education. So what did that look like for you on a very practical level in terms of combining those interests?
Sure. I think I'll start with the question about my background, and then I'll move on to how we're using intersectional analysis in our research currently. So, I'm an informaticist, epidemiologist, which means I studied health informatics and information management as well as epidemiology. And for me, in terms of how best I was able to sort of build a career that would consider things like how we use data to better report on intersectionality, I would probably, sort of speak to the work that we do, or the work that we do in health information management around standards. I think in public health, there is sort of a dearth of experience as it relates to informatics, and how critical informatics in today's digital age is to, to modern epidemiological methods. So I would almost encourage you to think about, obviously, engaging in epidemiology and thinking about, interdisciplinary approaches as well, more novel approaches in terms of understanding epidemiology. So, go out of your way and take a course in psychology. I took a SEM course in psychology, for example, where they have a lot of experience with looking at the different dimensions that may come up when it comes to intersectional analysis. And they have a lot of experience with qualitative methods, and then operationalizing that into, quantitative analysis. So really thinking about having a really diverse mixed methods approach to in your toolbox as it relates to methods. In addition, sort of to that, like I said, with the informatics background, I think it's really important to think about existing standards. So for example, social SDOH standards that exist, SOGI standards, sexual orientation and gender identity standards. These are really important, because when we're reporting, we want to be able to make comparisons with other jurisdictions, not necessarily in a deficit manner. It can be in a strength-based manner, but in order for us to really try to create systemic change, in many respects, it is important to rely on those standards. So being able to collect that data, at the grassroots level, by using standards that might be used by WHO or might be used elsewhere, I think is really important. So thinking of, exploring not only epidemiology, exploring mixed methods and, transdisciplinary approaches and novel approaches, as well as, like I mentioned, thinking about informatics and digital, the digital infrastructure and the ways in which we can support, quantitative analysis in that way. To sort of lead into my existing research, and I'll try to be brief because I know we're close now. My research sort of looks at VR, virtual reality, educational assessment. What we're trying to do is to build cultural humility capacity, not just from a skills-based perspective, which can be quite harmful, but to actually try to develop those values in individuals. I myself am a survivor of a healthcare encounter that was, discriminatory in many respects. And I thought about what's the best way for me to have an impact. And for me, that was leaning on my education and my experience to talk to BIPOC populations about their healthcare encounters, to create immersive experiences, to better train healthcare professionals, frontline providers, to allow them to be in a safe space, to be able to develop their capacities to communicate and to engage, and to recognize, what a patient might need. For example, I know we're dealing mostly in public health, but there could be potential applications to public health in future as well. And so that's how I'm currently using intersectionality. We're crafting really rich testimonial interviews. We're trying to build really complex cases, scenarios in which patients are dealing with mental health crisis, and they may also be racialized. They may be suffering from other comorbid conditions, or they may be overweight, and helping to navigate the student through that. And one last thing that we're doing from an informatics perspective that I wanted to highlight was an area that I'm interested in because it's quite data driven, is, we're looking at using facial tracking and biosignals, because there's that potential. Like I said, we're not trying to build skills, we're trying to build cultural humility and an appreciation for intersectionality in the work that these nurses and these emergency practitioners need to provide in their care. We want them to change their values. And so by virtue of using, facial tracking, and by virtue of using biosignals, we can circumvent some of what can happen as it relates to social desirability bias by really looking at that provider in that circumstance, when they're interacting with that patient who may be very complex, in part because of all the different intersecting factors that may be at play, their levels of stress, we can be able to track that and to sort of see how they are responding, so that we can better provide them with support in sort of key points of intervention to prevent some of the things that happened to me and that are happening to people across Canada, as we've seen with cases from Joyce Echaquan to Sinclair. We see these cases every day. So that's how we're doing it. It's sort of an informatics epidemiological approach, but we're using qualitative and quantitative methods and sort of trying to generate change in a systemic way.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Ramona. And Sammy, I'm going to come to you last. Thank you so much. We would love to hear your thoughts within the context of your current role as the executive director of the Black Health Education Collaborative, or perhaps some previous roles you've held. And also, we had a question from an attendee here about how we can ensure that we are keeping intersectionality from turning into a deficit conversation of priority populations without diminishing the challenges and struggles. So if you're able to comment on that as well, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernice. So I think I'm going to probably go into the deficit conversation part first, and then talk about some of the ways that we are applying intersectionality in our current work around knowledge production and training for public health students and medical students and practitioners. I think similar to all of the conversations that we're having around race or gender or all of the systems of oppression, I think it's critical to always remember that that this is not an individual-based deficit, or it's not a character. People are not inherently more vulnerable. They are not more, inherently at risk. They're not inherently susceptible to illness or to, life effects. And what is important to remember that these things are structural and they are done by design. So they are not accidental or incidental. So particularly, again, my area of work and interest is around racism and anti-Black racism. So I'm going to keep my examples to that particular section of intersectionality. So this idea of racism being an event or something that happens once in a blue moon, that is a rarity, is a concept that we've been continuously challenging, that it is in the guise, that it's in the air that we breathe, the water we drink, so it's in everything. And as such, we have to remind ourselves and our colleagues and others that might bring this up as a deficit-based conversation, that it's not about the communities. The problem is not centering the communities or the individual, that this is structural issue, that this has been done by design, and therefore the undoing of this problem only happens at a systems level. It happens when we have policies and legislations that allow for the course correction. One of the things that I just heard yesterday, I was listening to a podcast, is that past exclusions become present exclusions that lead to future exclusions. So when the status quo is maintained, those who are disadvantaged not only continue on a straight line, but that disadvantagement actually is amplified and actually builds into each other. So this idea of thinking about, when we think about racialized communities, when we think about people who have a different, when we think about classism or sexism or all of the isms, ageism, it's key to always remember that the problem is at the root of the system and the structure, and the solution is equally there. So in terms of how we've been using intersectionality in our work, and I'm going to refer to a question that was addressed earlier, but I just wanted to add to it, which was this idea of making sure that this conversation around intersectionality is not limited to those who are working on the SDOH or have a title within equity as their role, but that it becomes a practice within all public health professionals and decision makers across the board. So this idea of the need to include this work as a critical competency. So one of the pieces that we've been working with, most as recent as like last week, is particularly our team has been working with the Medical Council of Canada around instituting Black health objectives so they can become part of the licensing processes for new medical practitioners and new physicians. So equally, we are hoping to do something equally for public health practitioners and public health schools. So so it's having this idea of a twofold approach of having an opportunity to teach this in MPH programs, in nursing programs, in medical schools, so then that those who are graduating and coming into practice have this basic understanding of critical race theory, of intersectionality, of anti-Black racism, and all of the isms, and also have the critical thinking and the reflexivity to understand what role do they play, even as students or as new practitioners, not to continue the legacy of exclusions that have existed in this land for over 400 years, but to actively change their practice and the practice of their colleagues, as well as the practice of the institutions that they're planning to practice within. The counterpart to that is working with existing practitioners, those who've been in the field for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, who sometimes might have a more challenging understanding the theory, but also know how within their practice anti-Black racism shows up. So, and making it part of like continuing development, continued professional development, making it a requirement is the only way that we can do this. So this work cannot continuously only be done from the ground up by activists and those of us who are breaking down the doors, but also those who are decision-making places and have the power to institute change. And I invite every single person, the 116 people who are remaining on this webinar, to always have an opportunity to question yourself. What can I do today from where I sit with whatever resources I have? Often as public health practitioners, we have learned to pass the buck and say that this is a policy issue, that this is unprecedented, that it has not been done before. Just because it has not been done before, it does not mean it's not going to be done in the future or it's not possible. So I invite you to have that reflective practice and to center intersectionality in the work you're doing, whether you're a decision maker or your frontline staff, because you do have a power within the position that you're sitting in.
Thank you so much, Samia, and thank you to all of you who are still with us. We did integrate questions along the way. I know we're ending much later than we expected. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you to all of our panelists. We will pick this conversation up the next time. All the best to all of you. Thank you for filling out that evaluation in advance.